Most people know that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built as a grand tomb for Pharaoh. We think of these structures as silent monuments standing tall against the desert sky. But what if they were something much more complex? About 4,700 years ago, a ruler named Dosa built the first pyramid at Saqqara. Today, we call it a phenomenal architectural project, but some researchers believe this whole complex was actually a massive machine. Below the surface, there's a network of tunnels stretching over 3 miles long. Some think these tunnels were part of a sophisticated hydraulic system. Imagine a giant water-powered elevator lifting massive stones into the air like a volcano. It sounds like science fiction, right? Well, let's explore the mystery of the machine beneath the pyramids and discover how ancient engineering might change everything we know about history. Imagine standing in front of the largest man-made structure on the planet for thousands of years, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It rises up like a mountain of stone against the Egyptian sun. 4 centuries travelers and explorers looked at this massive monument and wondered what was hidden deep inside. Most of us grew up hearing the same story. These were grand tombs built to house the remains of powerful kings. They were meant to protect the pharaohs and their treasures as they traveled into the afterlife. But if that is the case, then we have a major problem. When explorers finally broke into the heart of the Great Pyramid, they found something that completely baffled them. There was no gold. There were no statues. There was no mummy. In fact, there was nothing but a single hollow stone box sitting in the middle of a dark, silent room. The sarcophagus was empty. This is a mystery that starts our journey today. If the Great Pyramid was not a tomb, then what on earth was it? Let us go back in time to the year 820. A powerful leader named Caliph Al-Ma'mun arrived at the Giza Plateau with a team of workers. He had heard the legends of immense wealth hidden behind the stone walls of the pyramid. He believed there were secret maps and ancient scrolls and heaps of gold waiting to be discovered. But there was one problem. The entrance to the pyramid was perfectly hidden. It was sealed with heavy limestone blocks that looked exactly like the rest of the structure. Al-Ma'mun and his team did not have a key, and they did not have a map. So they did what any determined treasure hunter would do. They decided to force their way in. They used fire and vinegar to crack the heavy stones. They hammered away day and night until they finally broke through. They created what we now call the Robber's Tunnel. As they crawled through the narrow, dark passages, they must have been terrified and excited at the same time. They were the first people in over 1,000 years to step foot inside this ancient marvel. They climbed up steep, slippery ramps and moved through narrow corridors. Finally, they reached the very center of the pyramid, a room we now call the King's Chamber. They held up their torches expecting to see the glint of gold and the reflection of jewels. But as the light filled the room, their hearts must have dropped. The walls were made of massive blocks of dark red granite. The floor was bare. There were no paintings and no hieroglyphs. And there in the corner was the object of their desire, the sarcophagus. But when they peeked inside, they did not find a king. They found nothing but dust. Not a single piece of jewelry or fragment of a mummy was ever found inside the Great Pyramid. Now, some historians say that grave robbers simply got there first. They argue that thieves must have broken in long ago and cleared out everything of value. But there's a major flaw in that theory. You see, the main entrance to the King's Chamber was blocked by massive granite plugs that weighed several tons. These blocks were so tightly fitted that even Al-Ma'mun had to dig around them. There is no evidence that anyone had ever breached those inner chambers before him. And then there's the box itself. We call it a sarcophagus because that is what we expect to find in a tomb. But if you look at it through the eyes of an engineer, it looks like something else entirely. This box was carved out of a single block of solid granite. And here is the kicker. It is actually too large to fit through the narrow passages leading into the room. This means the pyramid was literally built around the box. It was placed there before the ceiling was even finished. Why would you build an entire mountain of stone around an empty box? If it was meant to be a coffin for a king, why is it so plain? There are no inscriptions naming the pharaoh. There are no decorations. It is just a perfectly cut piece of stone. When researchers took a closer look at this granite box, they found something even more shocking. The precision of the cuts is absolutely mind-blowing. We are talking about tolerances that we would struggle to achieve today without high-tech power tools. The internal corners are sharp and the surfaces are incredibly flat. Some experts have even found circular saw marks and drill holes that suggest a technology far more advanced than copper chisels and stone hammers. If you try to cut granite with copper, it is like trying to cut a steak with a plastic spoon. It just does not work. So if the ancient Egyptians did not have power tools, how did they achieve this level of perfection? This is where the tomb theories start to fall apart. When you walk into a traditional Egyptian tomb like the ones in the Valley of the Kings, the walls are covered in stories. You see images of gods and rituals and the names of the deceased. It is like a giant stone scrapbook. But the Great Pyramid is silent. It is sterile. It is precise. It feels less like a resting place for a king and more like a machine that has been turned off. Let us talk about the room itself. The king's chamber is not just any room. It is a masterpiece of acoustic engineering. The walls and ceiling are made of huge granite beams. Some of these stones weigh up to 70 tons. To put that in perspective, a modern school bus weighs about 15 tons. So imagine lifting 5 school buses at once and placing them perfectly hundreds of feet in the air. This was a massive undertaking. But why use granite? Most of the pyramid is made of limestone. Limestone is easy to find and easy to cut. Granite, on the other hand, had to be brought from a quarry in Aswan, which is over 500 miles away. They had to transport these massive stones up the Nile on barges and then drag them across the desert. Why go to all that trouble if you just wanted to build a room for a dead body? Well, it turns out that granite has some very interesting properties. It is rich in quartz crystals, and quartz is what we call a piezoelectric material. This means that when it is put under pressure, it generates an electric charge. The entire king's chamber is designed to handle immense pressure from the millions of tons of stone sitting above it. Could it be that the ancient builders were trying to harness some kind of energy? Believe it or not, some researchers believe the Great Pyramid was actually a giant power plant. I know it sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but when you look at the evidence, it starts to make sense. Let us look at the Queen's Chamber located just below the King's Chamber. When explorers first entered this room, they found something very strange. The walls were covered in a thick layer of salt. In some places, the salt was an inch thick. Now, how did salt get into the middle of a stone pyramid in the desert? It turns out that this salt is a byproduct of a specific chemical reaction. Some scientists believe the Queen's Chamber was used as a reaction chamber to produce hydrogen gas. They think the ancient builders pumped chemicals through the narrow shaft that lead into the room. These chemicals would mix and create a gas that would then flow up into the rest of the pyramid. And what about those famous air shafts? For years, people thought they were built so the pharaoh's soul could fly out toward the stars. But these shafts are tiny. Some are only 8 inches wide. They are not big enough for a human to crawl through. And many of them do not even reach the outside of the pyramid. They are sealed off. If they were meant for air or for souls, why would you seal them? However, if you look at them as conduits for gas or for liquid, they make perfect sense. They are like the pipes in a giant engine. Imagine a system where water from the Nile was diverted into the plateau. The water could have been used to create pressure or to facilitate chemical reactions. We already know that the ancient Egyptians were masters of managing water. They built canals and irrigation systems that were the envy of the world. Is it so far-fetched to think they used that knowledge to power their most important structure? This brings us back to that empty stone box. If the pyramid was a machine, then the box might have been a crucial component. Maybe it was not a coffin at all. Maybe it was a housing for some kind of crystal or device that resonated at a specific frequency. When you stand inside the king's chamber and hum a specific note, the entire room begins to vibrate. The granite walls act like a giant tuning fork. The sound echoes and amplifies until you can feel it in your chest. It is a phenomenal experience. It is as if the room was designed to vibrate at a very specific frequency. And we know that frequency and vibration are the keys to many modern technologies. We use them in everything from medical imaging to telecommunications. Could the ancient Egyptians have been using sound and vibration to generate power or even to lift those massive stones into place? It sounds like a game changer for our understanding of history. But of course not everyone is on board with this idea. Traditional archaeologists insist that the Great Pyramid must be a tomb because that is what pyramids are for. They point to other pyramids where mummies were actually found. But the Great Pyramid is unique. It is the only one with such a complex internal system of shafts and chambers. It is the only one built with such incredible precision. It is like comparing a basic stone hut to a modern skyscraper. They might both be buildings, but they serve very different purposes. The more we look beneath the surface, the more we realize that the ancient Egyptians were working smarter, not harder. They were not just building monuments to their own ego. They were building sophisticated tools that interacted with the earth and the atmosphere. The empty sarcophagus is not a sign of failure or a sign of robbery. It is a sign that we have been looking at the pyramid all wrong. It was never meant to hold a body. It was meant to hold a secret of energy and engineering that we are only just beginning to decode. So if the Great Pyramid was a machine, then what was it powering? And where did this knowledge come from? To answer that, we need to look even deeper. We need to explore the tunnels and the subterranean chambers that were carved directly into the bedrock, because a machine does not just sit on top of the ground. It goes deep into the earth. It is a system that spans the entire Giza Plateau. And as we will see in the next part of our story, the secrets hidden in the dark may be even more shocking than the empty box in the king's chamber. Stay with me because the mystery of the machine beneath the pyramids is just getting started. Wait, did you know that the Great Pyramid is not the only place with these weird machine-like features? If we look at the step pyramid of Hosea, we see a whole different kind of complexity. It is over 3 miles of tunnels underground. 3 miles. That is a lot of digging for a simple tomb. And just like the Great Pyramid, researchers are finding evidence of water systems and hydraulic lifts. It is almost as if the entire civilization was obsessed with moving water and creating pressure. Some scientists have even suggested that the pyramids were used to stabilize the earth or to communicate with other sites around the world. It sounds far out, but when you see the mathematical alignment of these structures, it makes you stop and think. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within a fraction of a degree. This is better than the alignment of the Meridian building at the Greenwich Observatory in London. How did they achieve that without a compass or satellites? They were using the stars and the movement of the Earth itself. They were in tune with the planet in a way that we have completely forgotten. Every time we find a new chamber or a new tunnel, the machine theory gets a little bit stronger. Just recently, scientists used cosmic ray technology to scan the Great Pyramid, and they found a massive void above the Grand Gallery. They call it the Big Void. It is at least 100 feet long. And once again, it is empty. No treasure and no mummy. It is just a huge open space. Why would the builders leave a giant hole in the middle of their pyramid? If you are an architect, you know that empty spaces can be used to reduce weight or to improve acoustics. If the pyramid was a machine, then this void might be a resonant chamber or a place where gas was compressed. It is another piece of the puzzle that does not fit the tomb theory. We are looking at a structure that was designed with a purpose we are still trying to understand. It is like finding a giant computer in the desert and trying to figure out how it works by looking at the case. We need to open it up and look at the wiring. And that is exactly what we are going to do as we move forward. The machine is there and it is waiting for us to figure it out. Think about the sheer scale of the operation. To build the Great Pyramid, workers had to move over 2 million stone blocks. If they worked 10 hours a day every day, it would take them over 20 years to finish if they placed one block every few minutes. That is a massive workforce. But if they had help from machines or from the power of water, then the timeline starts to look a lot more realistic. We often underestimate the people of the past. We think they were primitive because they did not have electricity or the internet. But maybe they had something else. Maybe they had a different kind of technology that was based on the natural laws of the universe. They understood gravity and sound and pressure in ways that we are only just starting to rediscover. The empty box in the king's chamber is a reminder that there is so much more to this story. It is an invitation to look closer and to ask the difficult questions. Why did they build it? How did they build it? And what happened to the people who knew its secrets? The answers are waiting for us in the dark corners of the Giza Plateau. Let us keep going because the machine beneath the pyramids is about to reveal its true face. To understand the machine beneath the pyramids, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to go back to a place called Saqqara. Now most people who visit Egypt head straight for the big three at Giza, but if you want to find the true origins of this mystery, you need to look at the Step Pyramid of Djoser. This structure is nearly 5,000 years old, and as we talked about earlier, it sits on top of something that should not exist. Imagine a network of tunnels and chambers stretching over 3.5 miles long. It is a literal labyrinth carved deep into the limestone bedrock. If you were to walk down there today, you would see corridors that branch off into infinity and rooms that were sealed away for millennia. But here's the big question. Why would a king who is supposedly building a tomb spend 10 times more energy digging into the earth than he did building toward the sky? It does not make much sense if you are just thinking about a place to put a body, right? Most archaeologists tell us these tunnels were for the royal family or to store funeral goods. And to be fair, they did find thousands of stone vessels down there. We are talking about 40,000 jars and bowls made of materials like alabaster and slate. Some of these vessels are so thin they are almost translucent. But when researchers started looking at the layout of the tunnels, they noticed something very strange. The tunnels are not just random holes. They are organized in a way that looks remarkably like a modern plumbing system or complex industrial circuit. Think about the central shaft of the Djoser pyramid. It drops straight down for 90 feet. At the bottom of this massive hole, there's a giant vault made of granite blocks. Now, for years, people just called this a burial chamber. But when you look at how it was constructed, the story starts to change. The vault was sealed by a massive granite plug that weighed 3.5 tons. This plug was not just a lid. It was fitted with incredible precision. Some researchers believe this central shaft was actually the core of a giant hydraulic ram. Imagine water being channeled from that massive dry moat we mentioned earlier into this central shaft. The pressure would build up, and as the water level rose, it could lift a heavy float. This is the heart of the machine theory. It is the idea that the ancient Egyptians were not just builders. They were master plumbers who knew how to harness the weight and power of water to do the heavy lifting for them. Now let us talk about that labyrinth. It is not just one level. It is a multi-story complex of subterranean rooms. Some of these rooms are decorated with beautiful blue tiles meant to look like reed mats. It is stunning to look at, but some of the other chambers are completely empty and rough. Why the difference? Well, if this was an industrial machine, you would have some rooms meant for people to walk in, and others meant to house the inner workings of the system. Imagine some of these tunnels acting as overflow valves or filtration galleries. In fact, in the year 2024, a group of researchers published a study suggesting that the entire Saqqara complex was a sophisticated water treatment facility. They believed the dry moat acted as a sedimentation basin where dirty water would sit until the sand and grit sank to the bottom. Then the clean water would flow into the pyramid complex to power the lifts. It sounds like science fiction, right? But the evidence is carved into the very rock. When you look at the walls of the dry moat, you see these strange niches and compartments. For a long time, people thought they were just for decoration or for spiritual guards. But if you look at them through the eyes of an engineer, they look like sluice gates. These are the same kinds of structures we use today to control the flow of water in dams and canals. And here's the kicker. Some of these tunnels lead away from the pyramid toward other mysterious sites nearby. One of those sites is the Serapeum. Now, the Serapeum of Saqqara is a place that will truly blow your mind. It is a subterranean gallery that houses over 20 massive stone boxes. When I say massive, I mean these things weigh between 70 and 100 tons each. They are made of solid granite and diorite, which are some of the hardest stones on Earth. And they were brought here from a quarry hundreds of miles away. Most people are told these were coffins for sacred bulls. But there's a big problem with that theory. When archaeologists first opened these boxes, they were completely empty. Not a single bull was found inside the original sealed containers. But it is the precision of these boxes that really gets people talking. The surfaces are polished so smooth that they act like mirrors. The corners are perfectly 90 degrees. Even with our modern technology, it would be a massive challenge to carve the inside of a granite box with that kind of accuracy. So what were they really for? Some alternative researchers think these boxes were not for burial at all. They think they were part of the energy system. Granite is high in quartz, and quartz is piezoelectric. That is a fancy way of saying that if you put it under pressure, it can generate an electrical charge. If the machine beneath the pyramids was using water to create pressure, then these giant boxes could have acted as ancient capacitors or resonators. They were the batteries or the tuning forks of the complex. I know what you are thinking. This is a lot to take in. We are going from simple tombs to giant water power machines and granite batteries. But think about the scale of what we are looking at. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with measurement and order. Everything they built was aligned to the stars with precision that we can barely match today. If they were that good at astronomy, why would we assume they were bad at physics? It turns out that the deeper we go into these labyrinths, the more the whispers of the past start to sound like the hum of a machine. Take the air shaft in the Great Pyramid, for example. They call them air shaft because they lead from the king and queen chambers out toward the surface. But they are tiny. Too tiny for a person to crawl through, and for a long time we thought they were just for ventilation. But then they sent robots up there, and what did they find? They found tiny copper handles and mysterious doors. Copper is a great conductor of electricity. Why would you put copper handles on a stone door inside a narrow shaft if it was just for air? Some researchers believe those shafts were actually used to channel gases or liquids into the central chambers to create a chemical reaction. Now let us go back to the labyrinth beneath Dosa. One of the most haunting things about these tunnels is the sheer number of false doors and dead ends. If you were a thief trying to find the treasure, you will be lost in minutes. But if you were water flowing through a system, those dead ends could act as pressure chambers. Imagine the air being trapped at the end of a tunnel as water rushes in. That trapped air becomes a spring of energy. This is a common technique used in hydraulic systems to prevent water hammer, which is when a sudden change in flow causes a shock wave that can break pipes. The ancient builders might have designed the labyrinth to handle the incredible forces of the water machine so that the whole pyramid did not come crashing down. And then there are the inscriptions. In some of the deeper parts of the labyrinth, there are symbols that do not appear in any other Egyptian texts. Some people think they are a form of technical shorthand. Instead of telling a story about a god, they might be explaining how to operate the valves or when to open the gates. It is like finding a manual for a computer, but it is written in a language you can only half understand. Most people look at the pyramids and see a monument to death. But the more we look at the tunnels, the moats, and the shafts, the more it looks like a monument to life and energy. It was about using the natural world to create something monumental. They will work smarter, not harder people. Why would you have thousands of people dragging stones up a ramp for 20 years if you could just fill a shaft with water and let the laws of physics do the work for you? But even with all this evidence, the mainstream world is slow to change its mind. They say there is no mention of machines in the records. They say we have no blueprints. But maybe the pyramid itself is the blueprint. Maybe the machine is not something they used to build the pyramid, but rather the pyramid is a machine. The labyrinth beneath Saqqara is just a basement. The Great Pyramid of Giza is the ultimate version of this technology. As we move forward in our journey, we are going to look at the Giza Plateau itself. If Saqqara was the experimental prototype, then Giza was a finished product. We are going to look at the massive granite plugs, the strange resonance of the chambers, and the evidence of heat and chemical reactions that suggest the Great Pyramid was once a functioning power plant. The whispers from the labyrinth are getting louder, and they are telling us that we have only scratched the surface of what the ancient world was truly capable of. Think about the sheer ambition of it. To carve 3 miles of tunnels into the solid earth. To move boxes that weigh 100 tons through narrow passages. To create a system that can filter millions of gallons of water. It is a level of organization that is almost impossible to grasp. And yet there it is sitting under the sand waiting for us to figure out how to turn it back on. The machine beneath the pyramids is not just a theory. It is a physical reality that challenges everything we thought we knew about our ancestors. So the next time you see a picture of the step pyramid of Dosa, do not just look at the stone steps reaching for the clouds. Look at the ground beneath it. Imagine the water rushing through the tunnels. Imagine the granite plug rising in the shaft. Imagine the low hum of the stone as the pressure builds. Because the labyrinth is not a grave. It is an engine, and we are just now beginning to hear it start to turn. Now here is something that will really make you stop and think. If this system was powered by water, then where did all that water come from? Egypt is a desert, right? Well, it turns out that 5,000 years ago, the climate was very different. There was a period known as the African humid period when the Sahara was green and filled with lakes and rivers. There is evidence of an ancient lake that used to sit right next to the Saqqara complex. This lake could have provided a steady supply of water for the hydraulic system. But as the climate changed and the lake dried up, the machine would have stopped working. This could explain why the later pyramids are not as complex or as well built as the early ones. They lost their power source. They lost the water that made the machine run. It is a fascinating idea. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians were perfectly in tune with their environment. When the water was there, they built wonders that we still cannot explain. When the water left, they had to go back to building the hard way with ramps and ropes and thousands of workers. It is a reminder that even the most advanced technology is dependent on the world around it. But our story does not end at Saqqara. Not even close. Because if you think the labyrinth of Dosa is impressive, wait until you see what is hiding under the Giza Plateau. There is a whole other world of tunnels and shafts that link the 3 great pyramids and the Sphinx. Some people call it the city of the gods. Others call it the ultimate proof of the machine. And that is exactly where we are heading next. We are going to step out of the shadows of the labyrinth and into the heart of the most famous monuments on Earth to see if they were built for the dead or if they were designed to power the living. The machine is waiting, and its secrets are about to be revealed. Let us take a deep breath because the air is getting thin and the mysteries are only getting deeper. We are moving toward the Giza Plateau to see the ultimate power of the machine beneath the pyramids. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation. We are talking about millions of tons of stone. We are talking about precision to the millimeter. And we are talking about a subterranean world that connects it all. It is time to look at the Great Pyramid not as a tomb but as the most sophisticated piece of technology ever built by human hands. We are going to examine the evidence of hydrogen production, the traces of gold and copper, and the strange acoustic properties that make the stones ring like a bell. The labyrinth was just a beginning. The real whispers are coming from the heart of the mountain of stone itself. And those whispers are telling us that the machine is far bigger and far more powerful than we ever imagined. It is a journey that will take us from the depths of the earth to the peaks of the pyramids, and it will change the way you look at history forever. The ancient Egyptians were not just people of the past. In many ways, they were people of the future. And their machine is still there sitting under the sun and the sand, just waiting for someone to listen to its whispers. We are that someone. And the next chapter of this story is going to be the most incredible one yet. Let us keep moving because the truth is hidden in plain sight right beneath our feet. Now, if you think the story of the pyramids is just about ancient pharaohs and dusty mummies, you are in for a real surprise. To understand the mystery of the machine beneath the pyramids, we actually have to fast forward a few thousand years to the 19th century. This was a time known as Egyptomania. People in Europe, especially in England and France, became absolutely obsessed with anything and everything related to ancient Egypt. It was like a fever. They wanted the gold. They wanted the statues. And most importantly, they wanted to know what was hidden inside the structures that had been sealed for millennia. But the way they went about it was, well, a little bit different than how we do things today. You see, back then, archaeology was not exactly the careful science it is now. There were no tiny brushes or delicate tools. Instead, the early explorers used what we might call the brute force method. And that brings us to the Victorian breach. Imagine a time when the Great Pyramid of Giza was still mostly a mystery. The main entrance had been known for a while, but many of the internal chambers were still hidden behind massive blocks of limestone and granite. To get inside, the explorers of the 1800s decided to treat the pyramid less like a sacred tomb and more like a safe that needed to be cracked open. One of the most famous, or maybe infamous, characters in this part of the story is a man named Howard Vyse. Now, Vyse was a British colonel and an explorer, and he had a very specific way of solving problems. If a stone block was in his way, he did not try to slide it or find a hidden lever. He used gunpowder. Yes, you heard that right. He literally blasted his way through the history of ancient Egypt. In 1837, Vyse and his team were trying to find more chambers above the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid. They suspected there was something hidden up there, but the granite was too thick to move. So they just started setting off explosions. It sounds like something out of an action movie, but the results were actually pretty incredible. These explosions revealed what we now call the relieving chambers. These are 5 small compartments stacked on top of each other, designed to take the massive weight of the pyramid off the ceiling of the king's chamber. But here's the thing. When Vyse breached these walls, he found something that started a debate that is still going on today. He found what looked like an iron plate embedded deep within the masonry. Now, this is a huge deal. Why? Because according to everything we know about history, the ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom were not supposed to have iron technology yet. They were living in the Bronze Age. Iron was something that was not supposed to show up for another 1,000 years. This iron plate, which is now known as a Vyse relic, was stuck behind a layer of original stones. Some people thought it was just a piece of a modern tool that fell in during the blasting, but others argued that it was part of the original machine. If the pyramid was a hydraulic system or an energy plant, could this iron plate have been a part of a valve or a structural support? It was a Victorian discovery that pointed toward a technology that simply should not have existed. But Vyse was not the only one making waves. Around the same time, another explorer named Giovanni Belzoni was making his own mark. Belzoni was a fascinating guy. Before he became an explorer, he was actually a circus strongman in London. He was over 6.5 feet tall and incredibly strong, which came in handy when he was literally pushing over statues and breaking through tomb walls. Belzoni was the first person in modern times to enter the second pyramid of Giza, the Pyramid of Khafra. He found the entrance by looking for clues in the way the stones were laid out, which was a bit more sophisticated than using gunpowder, but he still had to use a lot of muscle to get through. When Belzoni got inside, he was disappointed to find the sarcophagus empty. But what he did find were these strange, narrow shafts and tunnels that did not seem to lead anywhere. To a Victorian mind, these looked like the inner workings of an industrial factory. Remember, this was the height of the Industrial Revolution in England. They were surrounded by steam engines, pistons, and complex pipes. When they looked at the interior of the pyramids, they did not just see a tomb. They saw familiar language of engineering. They saw shafts that could be air vents, or maybe conduits for something else. This brings us to one of the most intriguing discoveries of the entire Victorian era. In 1872, an engineer named Wayman Dixon was exploring the Queen's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. He noticed a small crack in the wall and decided to poke a wire into it. He realized there was a hollow space behind the stone. After some careful chiseling, he uncovered two shafts that had been completely sealed off from the rest of the chamber. These are now famous as the Dixon shafts. Inside these shafts, Dixon found three very strange objects. There was a small bronze hook, a bowl made of gray granite, and a piece of cedar with notches carved into it. These are known as the Dixon relics. Now, why would anyone put a hook and a bowl inside a tiny, sealed shaft in the middle of a massive pyramid? If the pyramid was just a tomb, these items make almost no sense. But if you think of the pyramid as a machine, they start to look like parts. Maybe the bowl was a weight for a pulley system. Maybe the hook was part of a trigger mechanism. The Victorians were the first to really grapple with the idea that the pyramids might have a functional, mechanical purpose. They were seeing things that did not fit the story of a simple burial. And because they were breaching these walls for the first time in thousands of years, they were seeing the machine in its most pristine state, before modern pollution and tourism changed the environment inside. But their methods also caused a lot of damage. Every time Vi set off a blast or Belzoni used a battering ram, they were potentially destroying the very evidence we need today to understand how the machine worked. It is like trying to learn how a computer works by hitting it with a hammer to see what is inside. You might find the chips in the boards, but you probably broke the connections that made it run. The Victorian breach was a double-edged sword. It opened the doors to the public, but it also clouded the mystery with smoke and debris. There is another weird part to this Victorian story. Many of these explorers started reporting strange physical sensations when they were inside the pyramids. They talked about feeling a hum in the air or experiencing electrical shocks when they touched certain stones. Now, we might just write that off as the heat or the excitement, but it adds another layer to the machine theory. If the pyramid was designed to collect or focus energy, the Victorians were the first people in a very long time to step into that energy field. Some researchers believe that the Victorian explorers actually accidentally deactivated part of the system. By breaking the vacuum seals in certain chambers or opening the shafts to the outside air, they changed the internal pressure and humidity. If the pyramid was a giant water pump or a hydraulic lift, the Victorian breach was like popping a hole in a pressurized pipe. The machine stopped working the moment they forced their way in. Imagine the scene back then. You have these men in top hats and heavy coats, standing in the dark, dusty corridors of Giza by the light of flickering torches. They are surrounded by millions of tons of stone that have been silent for 45 centuries. They are hearing the echoes of their own hammers, but they are also sensing that they are inside something much bigger than a grave. They were the ones who first started asking the question, what if this is a tool? What if this is an invention that we have forgotten how to use? As we look back at the Victorian breach, we have to realize that they were the ones who set the stage for everything that came after. They found the relics, they mapped the shafts, and they breached the hidden walls. They were the ones who first showed us that the pyramid was not just a solid pile of rock, but a complex, hollowed-out structure with secrets hidden deep in its core. But they also left us with a lot of questions. Was the iron plate real? What happened to the rest of the wooden tools? And why did the ancient Egyptians go to such incredible lengths to hide these mechanical-looking shafts? The Victorian era ended, but the breach they created stayed open. It invited the rest of the world to come and look at the machine for themselves. And as technology improved, we stopped using gunpowder and started using robots and cosmic rays. But the goal stayed the same. We are still trying to understand the blueprint that the Victorians first chiseled into. We are still trying to figure out if we are standing in a cemetery or a power plant. The truth is hidden in those very walls that were blasted open over 100 years ago. And as we dig deeper into the data they left behind, we start to see that the Victorian explorers might have been right about one thing. They were not just looking at history. They were looking at a machine that was waiting to be understood. Most people think of the Great Pyramid of Giza as a silent mountain of stone, a quiet place where a king was supposed to rest for eternity. But what if I told you that the heart of this massive structure was actually designed to be loud? And I do not mean loud like a construction site. I mean loud like a massive, vibrating musical instrument. This brings us to the most mysterious part of the whole pyramid, which is the king's chamber. Now, to understand why this room is so special, we have to look at what it is made of. Most of the Great Pyramid is built from local limestone. It is a sturdy rock, but it is relatively soft and easy to work with. However, when the builders reached the inner sanctum, they switched materials entirely. The king's chamber is made from massive blocks of red granite. Now, this is where things start to get interesting. This granite did not come from anywhere near Giza. It was quarried in Aswan, which is about 500 miles to the south. Imagine moving blocks of stone that weigh up to 80 tons each across that kind of distance. We are talking about the weight of a dozen elephants in a single block. Why would they go to all that trouble when they had perfectly good limestone right there? It turns out that red granite has some very specific physical properties that limestone just does not have. For one, it is incredibly hard. But more importantly, it is full of quartz crystals. And as it turns out, quartz is one of the best materials in the world for conducting and managing energy, especially sound energy. When you walk into the king's chamber today, the first thing you notice is how different the air feels. It is heavy and still, but it is also strangely resonant. If you speak or even just hum a low note, the whole room seems to vibrate along with you. It is almost like the room is talking back. For years, acoustic engineers and researchers have been bringing high-tech microphones and sensors into this space to see what is really going on. What they found is absolutely mind-blowing. The king's chamber is perfectly tuned to a specific frequency. When you create a sound of that frequency, the room hits what we call resonance. This means the sound waves bounce off the walls in such a way that they amplify each other, making the vibration stronger and stronger. It is like the entire room was designed to be a giant resonance chamber. But wait, it gets even more strange. In the middle of this room sits a lone stone box. Most people call it a sarcophagus, which is a fancy word for a coffin. But when you take a closer look, it just does not fit the description. Every other royal sarcophagus from ancient Egypt is covered in beautiful carvings and hieroglyphs. This one is completely plain. It is just a rough, hollowed-out block of granite. There was no lid found with it, and there were no signs that a mummy was ever inside. But here's the kicker. When a researcher hits the side of this box, it does not make a dull thud. It rings like a bell. It has its own specific musical pitch. Some people believe that this box was not a coffin at all, but rather a tuning fork for the entire pyramid. The idea is that if the pyramid was vibrating, the stone box would catch those vibrations and amplify them, creating a powerful hum that would fill the entire chamber. Now, why would anyone want a humming pyramid? Well, this is where the theory of the Giza power plant comes in. Some researchers, like the engineer Christopher Dunn, believe that the Great Pyramid was actually a sophisticated machine designed to generate energy. He points out that the granite used in the king's chamber is rich in quartz, which is piezoelectric. Now, that is a big word, but it just means that if you put the stone under a lot of pressure or vibrate it, it produces an electrical charge. Imagine the millions of tons of limestone sitting on top of the king's chamber. That is an incredible amount of pressure. If you could get those granite blocks to vibrate at their resonant frequency, they would essentially become a giant electrical generator. It is like the ancient Egyptians were using the earth itself as a source of power. They were tapping into the natural vibrations of our planet and turning them into something they could use. It sounds like science fiction, but the more we look at the precision of the construction, the more it starts to look like engineering. The ceiling of the king's chamber is another part of the mystery. Above the room, there are 5 separate layers of massive granite beams. For a long time, historians told us these were relieving chambers. They said they were there to take the weight of the pyramid and stop the ceiling from collapsing. But modern engineers have looked at the math and they say that is not quite right. A single layer of beams would have been more than enough to handle the weight. So why add 4 more? When you look at them, they look exactly like the baffles or resonators you might find inside a modern silencer or a high-tech acoustic lab. Each layer is separated by an air gap, which would allow them to vibrate independently. It is almost like a giant stack of tuning forks. And then there are the shafts. Most people call them air shafts, but they do not really work for ventilation. They are too small and they have strange bends in them. Some of them do not even go all the way to the outside of the pyramid. But if you think of them as conduits for energy or sound, they make perfect sense. They could have been used to channel specific frequencies or even gases into the chamber to help the reaction along. It is like every single part of the pyramid, from the giant stones to the tiny shafts, was part of a larger, integrated system. If the king's chamber was the heart of the machine, then the Grand Gallery was the lungs. The Grand Gallery is that long, sloping hallway that leads up to the king's chamber. It is about 150 feet long and almost 30 feet high. The walls are built in what is called a kobold style, which means each layer of stone sticks out a little bit more than the one below it. This creates a sort of jagged, stepped ceiling. Researchers have found that this shape is perfect for reflecting and amplifying sound waves. They even found notches in the side ramps of the gallery that look like they could have held giant wooden frames. Some believe these frames held acoustic resonators, which would have hummed as the Earth's vibrations passed through them. Imagine standing in the Grand Gallery while the machine was running. The sound would have been deafening. It would have been a deep, low rumble that you could feel in your bones. That sound would have been channeled up into the king's chamber, where it would hit the granite blocks and start the electrical reaction. It is a completely different way of looking at the pyramid. Instead of a silent tomb, we see a roaring, vibrating factory of energy. It changes everything we think we know about the people who built it. They were not just laborers with copper chisels. They were master engineers who understood the physics of sound and the properties of stone in a way that we are only just beginning to rediscover. Now, I know what you are thinking. This sounds way too advanced for people living 4,500 years ago. But when you look at the evidence, it is hard to ignore. The precision of the granite blocks is better than what we can do with most modern machinery today. They are flat to within 1,000th of an inch. You cannot even slide a credit card between the joints. This kind of work is not just for decoration. You only do work that precise if you are building a machine that has to work perfectly. If one of those stones was out of place, the resonance would be ruined and the whole system would fail. But if this was a power plant, where did the energy go? That is the question that still stumps a lot of people. Some think it was used to provide light for the temples or to help in the manufacturing of chemicals. Others think it might have been used for something even more exotic, like communication or even some kind of ancient high technology we do not have a name for yet. There is even a theory that the pyramid used water from the Nile to help generate the energy. They believe the water would flow into the underground chambers and create a sort of hydraulic pulse that would get the whole pyramid vibrating. It is like a giant water-powered heart beating inside the stone. There is still so much we do not know. We are like children looking at a computer and thinking it is just a very heavy paperweight. We see the stones and we think tomb because that is all we can imagine. But the more we study the king's chamber and its amazing resonance, the more it feels like we are looking at a piece of technology that was waiting to be understood. It is a powerful reminder that history is not always a straight line of progress. Sometimes, the people who came before us knew things that we have completely forgotten. They were using the natural laws of the universe to create something that we are still trying to figure out today. And that makes the Great Pyramid of Giza not just a monument to a dead king, but a monument to a level of human ingenuity that is truly out of this world. The mystery of the king's chamber does not end with the sound. It also has to do with the light and the stars. Those shafts we talk about actually point to very specific parts of the night sky. One points toward the North Star, and another points toward the Belt of Orion. For a long time, people thought this was just for the pharaoh's soul to fly out to the stars. But if the pyramid was a machine, maybe those shafts were used to collect a different kind of energy from the sky. Maybe they were like giant antennas catching cosmic rays or starlight. It sounds crazy, but when you are talking about a structure that is this perfect and this complex, you have to keep an open mind. Everything in the pyramid was put there for a reason. There is no such thing as a coincidence when you are dealing with millions of tons of stone that are aligned to the stars with the precision of a modern telescope. As we look closer at the walls of the chamber, we see that they are not just blocks. They are part of a giant, interconnected circuit. The granite, the quartz, the water, and the sound all come together in one place to create something incredible. It is like the ancient Egyptians were masters of a secret science that we are only just now starting to get a glimpse of. They were building a bridge between the earth and the sky, using nothing but stone and the power of resonance. And while we might not have all the answers yet, one thing is for sure. The king's chamber is still humming with the secrets of a lost age, just waiting for us to listen closely enough to hear them. It is a story that is as loud and as powerful as a vibration that once filled that stone room so many thousands of years ago. It turns out that the most quiet place on earth might have actually been the loudest. Imagine standing on the Giza Plateau thousands of years ago, but instead of the quiet, dusty desert we see today, the ground beneath your feet is vibrating. There is a deep, rhythmic thumping sound, like a giant heart beating somewhere deep in the earth. It is a sound that echoes through the stones and ripples across the surface of the Nile River nearby. For many people, the pyramids are just silent stone monuments, but some researchers believe that during their prime, these structures were loud, active, and full of moving energy. They think the Great Pyramid was not just a tomb, but a massive hydraulic machine. And every machine needs a heartbeat. In this case, that heartbeat was a flow of water. Let us start by looking at the very bottom of the Great Pyramid, way down in the dark. Most visitors look at the King's Chamber or the Grand Gallery, but the real mystery begins in the subterranean chamber. This is a room carved directly into the bedrock, hundreds of feet below the pyramid base. If you go down there today, it looks messy and unfinished. The floor is uneven, and it looks like the workers just gave up and went home. But what if that mess was actually intentional? Some engineers have pointed out that this chamber looks exactly like the internal workings of a hydraulic ram pump. In a normal pump, you use the pressure of a large amount of flowing water to force a smaller amount of water to a much higher elevation. It is a clever trick of physics that does not require any electricity. To make this work, you need a source of water and a way to create a pulse. This is where the Nile comes in. Back when the pyramids were built, The river was much closer to the plateau than it is now. There are traces of ancient canals and tunnels that suggest water was channeled directly toward the base of the pyramid. If water flowed down the long descending passage and into that messy subterranean chamber, it would create a lot of pressure. Now, imagine a sudden stop in that flow. In plumbing, we call this a water hammer. It is that loud thumping sound you hear in your pipes when you turn off a faucet too quickly. That thumping is actually a shockwave of energy. If the subterranean chamber was designed to trap and release these shockwaves, it would act like the heartbeat of the entire building, sending pulses of pressure up through the passages. But why would the Egyptians want a giant water pump? Well, some think they were trying to move more than just water. They might have been moving energy. As those pulses of water pressure moved through the pyramid, they would have hit the massive granite blocks in the king's chamber. Now, here's a cool science fact for you. Granite is full of quartz crystals. When you squeeze or put pressure on quartz, it creates a tiny bit of electricity. This is called the piezoelectric effect. If the entire pyramid was pulsing with water pressure, it would be squeezing those granite blocks over and over again. It would be like a giant stone battery, constantly humming with power. Think about the layout of the internal passages for a second. You have the descending passage going down and the ascending passage going up. It looks like a complex system of pipes. In the middle, you have the grand gallery, which is this huge, soaring space with slanted walls. For a long time, people thought it was just a fancy hallway for a funeral procession. But if you look at it through the eyes of an engineer, it looks like a massive pressure valve or a dampening chamber. Those weird slots in the walls might have held wooden structures or gates that regulated the flow of water or air. It is like the ancient Egyptians were building a high-tech power plant using nothing but stone and gravity. Now, you might be wondering, if there was all this water inside the pyramid, where did it go? If you look at the outside of the Great Pyramid, there are 4 very small, narrow shafts that lead from the king's and queen's chambers toward the exterior. For years, archaeologists called these air shafts, thinking they were for ventilation. But there's a big problem with that idea. Some of these shafts do not even go all the way to the outside, and they are way too small for a person to crawl through. Also, dead kings do not really need to breathe, right? So, if they were not for air, what were they for? Some researchers believe they were actually outlets for water or steam. If the pyramid was a machine, these shafts could have been like the exhaust pipes on a car, letting out the extra pressure to keep the system from exploding. It is also interesting to look at the materials used in different parts of the pyramid. The outside was originally covered in white Chura limestone. This stone is very good at reflecting heat and acting as an insulator. But the inside was made of granite and dolomite, which are great at conducting energy and withstanding high pressure. It is like they built a thermos on the outside and an engine on the inside. This was not a random choice. These builders knew exactly which stones to use for each job. It makes you realize that they were not just laborers pushing rocks. They were master chemists and physicists. Of course, not everyone agrees with the machine theory. Many traditional historians say that there is no evidence the Egyptians had the technology to build such a complex pump. They argue that the subterranean chamber is unfinished simply because the pharaoh changed his mind about where he wanted to be buried. It happens, right? But then you have to ask yourself, if they were so good at building the most perfect structure in the world, why would they be so messy with the bottom floor? It just does not add up. Plus, there are no inscriptions inside the Great Pyramid, no paintings of the king, no stories of his life, and no hieroglyphs at all. Every other tomb in Egypt is covered in writing. Why is the biggest one of all completely blank? Maybe it is because it was not a tomb. You do not put wallpaper and paintings inside the engine of your car, do you? You just want the engine to work. There is another place nearby that adds to this mystery. It is called the Serapeum of Saqqara. Inside this underground complex, there are dozens of massive granite boxes. Each one weighs about 80 tons, and the lids weigh another 30 tons. They are finished with incredible precision, with surfaces so flat that they look like they were cut with a laser. Archaeologists say these were coffins for sacred bulls, but when they opened them, they were all empty. No bulls, no mummies, nothing. But what they did find was a weird residue on the inside. Some believe these boxes were actually part of the same hydraulic system, acting as storage tanks or chemical reaction chambers. When you connect the dots between Giza and Saqqara, you start to see a whole landscape that was engineered to manage and use the power of water. Imagine the Nile flooding every year. For most people, a flood is a disaster. But for the ancient Egyptians, it was a fuel for their machine. As the water levels rose, the pressure in the tunnels would increase. The heartbeat would get faster and stronger. The whole Giza Plateau would start to hum with a low-frequency sound that you could feel in your bones. It would have been a sight to behold. A giant, white, glowing pyramid topped with gold, vibrating and pulsing with the life force of the river. It puts a whole new spin on the idea of a monument to the afterlife. Maybe they were not trying to help the king get to the stars. Maybe they were trying to bring the power of the stars down to earth. The more we look at the pyramids, the more we find things that look like mechanical parts. Even the stone plugs in the ascending passage look like check valves that only let water flow in one direction. And those weird notches in the queen's chamber, they could be mounts for a large piece of equipment that was taken away a long time ago. It is like finding a giant computer in the woods and trying to figure out what it does just by looking at the empty case. We are missing the software, and we are missing the moving parts. But the plumbing is still there. If the pyramid really was a hydraulic machine, it means the ancient Egyptians had a level of technology that we are only just beginning to understand. It suggests that they were working with the natural forces of the earth rather than fighting against them. They used the weight of the stone, the flow of the river, and the vibration of the earth to create something truly magical. Whether it was a power plant, a water pump, or a giant acoustic device, one thing is certain. The heartbeat of the pyramid was a heartbeat of Egypt itself. It was a system that connected the river, the land, and the sky into one massive, thumping machine. And while the water has long since stopped flowing, if you stand very still in the shadow of the Great Pyramid today, you might still feel a tiny ghost of that vibration, a reminder of the machine that once lived beneath the sands. But wait, if the pyramid was a machine, who was running it? And what happened to all that power? Some people think the answer lies not in the stones themselves, but in the strange artifacts that have been found scattered across the desert. From copper pipes that should not exist to strange batteries found in jars, the clues are everywhere. It makes you wonder if we've been reading the history books upside down this whole time. Instead of a primitive society building big graves, we might be looking at a high-tech civilization that simply ran out of fuel. Or maybe they did not run out of fuel. Maybe they just turned the machine off and left it for us to find, like a giant puzzle waiting to be solved. And the next piece of that puzzle is even more shocking than a water-powered heartbeat. It turns out that the most solid building on the planet might have a secret door that leads to a place no one was ever supposed to see. For a long time, we thought we knew every single inch of the Great Pyramid of Giza. After all researchers and explorers have been crawling through those narrow tunnels and climbing up the Grand Gallery for hundreds of years, we have measured the stones and mapped out the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber until we could probably draw the whole thing from memory. It seemed like the pyramid had finally given up all its secrets. But in the last few years, we realized that we were only looking at the shell of the nut. We were missing something huge, and it was hiding right in front of us inside the solid rock. The problem is that you cannot just go around knocking down walls in a world wonder to see what is behind them. That would be like trying to find a hidden room in your house by using a wrecking ball. It is just not a good idea. So how do you look inside a giant stone mountain without touching it? Well, you use the stars. Or more specifically, you use the tiny invisible particles that fall from the stars every single second of every single day. This brings us to a mind-blowing technology called muon tomography. Now I know that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but it is actually based on very real physics. To understand how it works, you have to imagine the universe is constantly raining. But instead of water drops, it is raining cosmic rays. These cosmic rays are high-energy particles that travel through space at nearly the speed of light. They come from exploding stars and distant galaxies, and they are hitting our atmosphere all the time. When these cosmic rays hit the air, they shatter and create a shower of even smaller particles called muons. These muons are like the heavy cousins of electrons. They are tiny, but they are incredibly fast, and they can pass through almost anything. Right now, as you are reading this, there are millions of muons passing through your body. They pass through your house, and they pass through the ground. But here's the trick. Even though muons are great at passing through things, they do slow down or get absorbed when they hit something really dense like solid rock. Think of it like an X-ray at the doctor's office. An X-ray can pass through your skin and muscles, but it gets blocked by your bones. That is why the bones show up as white on the film. Muon scanning works the same way, but on a much bigger scale. If you put a muon detector underneath a giant structure like a pyramid, the particles that pass through empty spaces like tunnels or chambers will reach the detector much faster, and in higher numbers than the ones that have to fight their way through solid limestone. By counting how many muons make it through different parts of the pyramid, scientists can create a three-dimensional map of the inside. It is like the pyramid is becoming transparent right before our eyes. This is exactly what a group of researchers from the Scan Pyramids project started doing back in 2015. They teamed up with experts from Japan and France and Egypt to see if they could find anything that the pharaohs had hidden away. They placed these special detectors, which are basically like very high-tech digital cameras for subatomic particles, inside the Queen's chamber. For months they sat there in the dark and the quiet, just waiting and listening to the invisible rain of the universe. And in 2017 they dropped a bombshell on the world of archaeology. They found a giant empty space that nobody knew existed. They called it the Big Void. This was not just a small hole or a crack in the rock. This was a massive chamber at least 30 meters long, which is about 100 feet. To put that in perspective, that is about the size of a large passenger airplane. And the craziest part is where it is located. The Big Void is sitting directly above the Grand Gallery, which is that famous sloping hallway that leads up to the King's Chamber. When the news broke, people went wild with theories. Was it a secret burial chamber? Was it a hidden library full of ancient scrolls? Or if we go back to the idea of the pyramid as a giant machine, could this void be a functional part of the system? Some researchers think the Big Void might have been used to help balance the weight of the Grand Gallery, so the whole thing would not collapse under the pressure of the stones above it. But others think that explanation is a bit too simple. Why would they make such a huge space just for structural support? If you look at the way the pyramid is built, every single corridor and chamber seems to have a very specific purpose. The Big Void is a giant question mark right in the middle of the most famous building on Earth. But the mystery did not stop there. In March of 2023, the Scan Pyramids team announced another massive discovery. This time they found a secret corridor behind the north face of the pyramid right near the original entrance. This corridor is about 9 meters long and 2 meters wide. It has a gabled ceiling, which means the stones are slanted like the roof of a house. This shape is usually used to protect a space from heavy weight. What is really cool about this discovery is that for the first time we actually got to see inside. The researchers were able to feed a tiny endoscope camera through a small crack between the stones. They saw a hallway that had been sealed off for over 4,000 years. There were no footprints in the dust and no signs that anyone had ever been there. It was perfectly preserved like a time capsule. So why did the ancient builders create these hidden spaces? If the pyramid was just a tomb, why make it so complicated? Why build giant voids and secret corridors that are completely inaccessible? If you think about the hydraulic lift theory we talked about earlier, these voids start to look a lot more interesting. Some people believe that the internal structure of the pyramid was designed to move water or air, or perhaps even to act as a giant acoustic resonator. There is a theory that the Grand Gallery was not just a hallway but a track for heavy weights that could be moved up and down using water pressure. If that is true, then the big void above it might have been part of the machinery. Maybe it was a space for ropes and pulleys, or a reservoir for air to regulate pressure. Of course, not everyone is convinced by these high-tech theories. Traditional archaeologists like the famous Zai argue that these voids are likely just construction gaps. He thinks that when the builders were making the Grand Gallery, they left the space above it to take the pressure off the ceiling. According to this view, the pyramid is just a very big pile of rocks, and the voids are just the spaces where they did not put any rocks. But the Scan Pyramids team says the data shows the big void is too intentional and too large to be a mistake or a simple relief chamber. They are planning to use even more advanced detectors to get a clearer picture of what is inside. They want to see if there are any artifacts or if the walls are covered in inscriptions. It is a strange feeling to realize that we are still discovering parts of the Great Pyramid in the 21st century. We have satellites that can map the whole globe and telescopes that can see the beginning of time, but we are still surprised by a building that has been standing in the desert for 4 millenniums. This is why muon scanning is such a game changer. It allows us to explore without destroying. It shows us that there is still so much we do not know about the cleverness of the ancient Egyptians. They were not just builders. They were masters of geometry and physics, and maybe even some technologies that we are only now beginning to understand. Imagine if the pyramid really was a machine. If the big void was engine room and the tunnels were pipes and the chambers were pressure valves, it would mean that the ancient world was far more advanced than we ever gave them credit for. We tend to think of history as a straight line where we keep getting smarter and more technical as time goes on. But what if the Egyptians reached a peak of engineering that we are only just now catching up to? What if they were using the natural forces of the earth like water and pressure and gravity in ways that we have forgotten? The search for the machine beneath the pyramids is far from over. Every time we use a new technology like muons or thermal imaging or ground-penetrating radar, we find another piece of the puzzle. We find another hidden room or another strange anomaly that does not fit the traditional story. It makes you wonder what else is down there. If there is a 30-meter void hiding in the middle of the Great Pyramid, what is hiding under the pores of the Sphinx? Or deep beneath the sand of the Valley of the Kings? We are living in a new age of discovery where we can see the invisible and look through solid walls. And as we peer into the dark using the light of cosmic rays, we might find that the ancient Egyptians left us a lot more than just some gold and a few mummies. They might have left us a blueprint for a technology that could change our future if we can just figure out how to turn it back on. But even with all this high-tech scanning, there are some parts of the pyramid that seem to defy explanation. There are small shafts that lead out from the king's and queen's chambers that align perfectly with specific stars in the night sky. Scientists have sent little robots up these shafts only to find secret doors with copper handles. Why put handles on a door that is only 8 inches wide and hidden deep inside a wall? It is like the ancient builders were playing a game with us, leaving hints and traps that would take thousands of years to unravel. As we continue to map out these dark spaces, we have to ask ourselves a big question. If the pyramid was a machine, what was it actually for? Was it for lifting stones? Was it for generating power? Or was it for something even more mysterious like communication with the stars? Whatever the answer is, the discovery of the big void and the secret corridors has proven one thing for sure. The Great Pyramid is not a solid block of stone. It is a complex and hollowed-out masterpiece of engineering. It is a giant labyrinth of secrets, and we are just starting to scratch the surface. The next time you look at a photo of the pyramids, remember that there's an invisible rain of particles passing through them right now, showing us a world that has been hidden in the dark for 47 centuries. And as we follow those muons deeper into the heart of the stone, we might just find the key to the entire machine. It turns out that the deeper we look, the more we realize that the most famous buildings on Earth are still full of surprises. Most people think of the Great Pyramid as a massive pile of limestone and granite. It is a stone monument for a Stone Age civilization, right? Well, that is where things get a little bit more metallic. Deep inside the Great Pyramid, in the shafts of the Queen's Chamber, archaeologists found something that should not really be there if it was just a tomb. They found copper. Small, carefully crafted copper fittings. Now, why would anyone go through the trouble of placing metal ornaments or tools deep inside a narrow shaft that no human could ever fit into? Let us back up a bit and talk about the discovery that shocked the world in the 1990s. A German engineer named Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot called U-Put into the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. These shafts are tiny, only about 8 inches wide. They were hidden behind the walls of the chamber for thousands of years until they were discovered in the 1800s. Gantenbrink's robot crawled up the steep incline for about 200 feet until it hit a dead end. It found a solid limestone slab with 2 small copper pins or handles sticking out of it. It looked exactly like a door. This find changed everything. For the first time, we had proof that the pyramid was not just stone. There was metal integrated into the very core of the structure. These copper pins had little loops on them, and some researchers think they might have been part of a larger electrical or mechanical system. But why copper? If you are a fan of modern technology, you know that copper is one of the best conductors of electricity we have. It is used in everything from your phone to the wiring in your house. Seeing it in a 4,500-year-old structure raises some serious questions. If the ancient Egyptians wanted to build a simple tomb, why would they need conductive metal fittings at the end of a narrow air shaft? Some people think these pins were just handles to lift the stone block into place. But that does not really hold up. The pins are far too small and fragile to be used for moving a heavy limestone slab. Plus, the shafts are so narrow that no worker could have ever reached the door to pull on the handles anyway. It is like putting a doorknob on a door that is buried underground inside a wall. It just does not make any practical sense unless the copper had another purpose. One of the most intriguing theories is that these copper fittings were part of a giant chemical power plant. This idea suggests that the Great Pyramid was designed to create energy through a series of chemical reactions. In this scenario, the shafts were used to deliver different chemicals into the chambers. The southern shaft would carry one liquid, and the northern shaft would carry another. When these chemicals mix in the main chamber, they would create hydrogen gas. And what role does the copper play? Well, in this machine theory, the copper pins acted as sensors or electrodes. They could have been used to tell the builders when the liquid level was high enough, or they might have been part of a circuit that allowed the pyramid to harness the energy being created. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but let us look at the chemistry. To make this work, you would need certain materials. Some researchers suggest that the Egyptians used a diluted hydrochloric acid and a zinc solution. Interestingly, when archaeologists first entered the Queen's Chamber, they found a strange salty crust on the walls. For years, people thought it was just a result of the limestone sweating. But when they analyzed it, they found it was a mixture of calcium carbonate and halite. This could be the leftover residue from the chemical reactions we are talking about. If the copper was part of a conduit system for these chemicals, it would explain why it was placed so precisely. Now, where did all this copper come from? In ancient Egypt, copper was incredibly valuable. It was like the gold of the industrial world back then. Most of it was mined in the Sinai Peninsula in a place called the Wadi Magara, which people often call the Terraces of Turquoise. Mining copper was a massive undertaking. The Egyptians had to send huge expeditions of thousands of men into the harsh desert. They used stone tools to hack the ore out of the rock and then smelted it on site using charcoal fires. It was hot, grueling work. The fact that they took this hard-earned metal and tucked it away deep inside a pyramid shaft tells us that it was essential. It was not just a decoration. In fact, when a new robot called Jetty went back into the shafts in the year 2011, it was equipped with a micro camera that could look around corners. When it peeked behind the copper pins, it saw something even more mysterious. The back of the pins were looped over, almost like they were designed to hold a wire or a cord. And on the floor of the tiny chamber behind the door, there were red markings. There were hieroglyphs written by the builders that had not been seen by human eyes for millennia. This discovery made the machine theory even more popular. If the pins were loops for a wire, then the shafts really could have been a copper conduit. Imagine the pyramid not as a silent stone mountain, but as a buzzing, active machine with wires running through its dark passages. We know that the Egyptians were masters of their environment. They knew how to move water, how to build massive structures, and how to work with complex materials. Is it really that far of a stretch to think they understood basic conductivity? Think about the precision of these shafts for a moment. They are not just random holes. They are perfectly straight for hundreds of feet, even when they have to bend around other parts of the pyramid like the Grand Gallery. To build something like that, the architects had to plan it from the very first stone. They had to know exactly where that copper would go. This level of planning suggests a functional requirement, not a symbolic one. In most Egyptian tombs, the art and the inscriptions on the wall for everyone to see. But these shafts were hidden. The copper was hidden. It was part of the internal workings of the pyramid, like the pipes behind the walls of your bathroom. And speaking of pipes, the Giza Plateau has a very strange drainage system. There are channels carved into the bedrock all around the pyramids. For a long time, archaeologists thought these were just for rainwater. But Egypt does not get that much rain. When you look at the layout, it looks like a sophisticated plumbing system designed to move large volumes of water. If you connect the water management on the outside with the copper conduits on the inside, a picture starts to emerge. It is a picture of a hydraulic or chemical machine that used the natural resources of the Nile to function. Let us talk about some other weird artifact that might support this idea. Most of you have probably heard of the Baghdad battery. It is a small clay jar found in Iraq that contains a copper cylinder and an iron rod. When you fill it with an acidic liquid like grape juice or vinegar, it produces a small amount of electricity. While this was found in Mesopotamia and not Egypt, it proves that ancient civilizations were experimenting with electrochemistry thousands of years ago. If a small village could make a battery, what could a civilization that built the Great Pyramid do? In Egypt, we also have the dendrolite. It is a relief carved on the wall of the Temple of Itha that looks suspiciously like a giant light bulb. It shows a long, transparent object with a snake-like wire inside it, connected to a cable and a battery. Traditional archaeologists say it is just a symbol of a lotus flower and a snake. But engineers who look at it see a blueprint for a vacuum tube. If the Egyptians had the copper and the knowledge to create conduits, could they have been lighting their dark underground tunnels with something other than smoky torches? Some researchers have pointed out that there is no soot on the ceilings of many of the deepest Egyptian tombs. If they were using torches to see while they painted those beautiful murals, there should be black carbon deposits everywhere. But in many places, there are none. This has led some to believe they used a system of mirrors to reflect sunlight deep into the earth, or perhaps they had a more advanced way of generating light. This is where the copper conduit comes back into play. If the pyramid was a power plant, that power had to go somewhere. The copper pins in the Queen's chamber are currently the only metal objects ever found in place inside the Great Pyramid. That makes them incredibly special. They are the smoking gun for anyone who believed the pyramids were more than just tombs. Even if you do not believe in the power plant theory, you have to admit that the presence of copper at the end of a hidden, inaccessible shaft is a massive riddle. It challenges the idea that the ancient Egyptians were only using stone and wood tools. They were integrated with their technology in a way we are only just beginning to understand. It is also worth noting that copper was often associated with the goddess Itha, who was a patron of miners. She was known as the Lady of Turquoise and the Lady of Copper. The Egyptians believed that metals had spiritual properties, but they also knew they had physical ones. They used copper for mirrors, for needles, for saws to cut stone, and for pipes. In the funerary complex of Pharaoh Sahur, archaeologists found over 1,000 feet of copper piping that was used to drain a temple. This was built during the 5th dynasty, not long after the Great Pyramid. So, we know for a fact that they were using copper for complex plumbing systems. If they could build a 1,000-foot plumbing system out of copper, putting a few pins and conduits into the Great Pyramid would have been a simple task. The mystery is not whether they could do it, but why they did it in such a secret way. Every discovery we make, from the U-Port robot to the Jetty mission, brings us closer to the metal. It reminds us that there is a machine-like quality to the pyramids that we cannot ignore. The more we look at the copper, the more we see the connections between the stone, the water, and the ancient science that built the most famous monuments in history. So, next time you look at a picture of the Great Pyramid, do not just see a tomb. Think about the tiny copper loops hidden deep inside the walls. Think about the red hieroglyphs and the limestone doors. And think about the possibility that beneath the stone there was a heart of metal waiting to be turned on. The copper conduit is just one piece of the puzzle, but it is a piece that changes the entire picture of what ancient Egypt was really capable of doing. As we peel back the layers of stone and metal, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a technical mystery that has lasted for thousands of years. It turns out that the copper might be the key to unlocking the true purpose of the machine beneath the pyramids. When we think of machines today, our minds usually go straight to things made of steel and plastic and powered by electricity. But thousands of years ago, the ancient Egyptians might have been building a massive machine using the most durable materials on the planet. I am talking about granite. Now, if the copper we were just talking about acted as a wiring for this massive system, then the granite was the engine block. Most people look at the Great Pyramid and see those millions of limestone blocks on the outside, but the real mystery is happening deep on the inside in the chambers made of heavy red granite. Granite is a completely different beast than limestone. Limestone is relatively soft and easy to carve, but granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth. To the ancient Egyptians, granite was like the titanium of their world. They did not just use a little bit of it either. They used massive slabs, some weighing up to 70 tons. And here's the thing, they did not just find this rock in their backyard. They had to haul it all the way from Aswan, which is over 500 miles away from Giza. Imagine moving a 70-ton block, which is about the weight of 10 large African elephants, across a desert and then lifting it 150 feet into the air to place it perfectly inside the pyramid. It is a phenomenal engineering project, but researchers are starting to think it was not just about building a sturdy room for a king. They think the choice of granite was very deliberate because of its physical properties. You see, granite is full of quartz crystals, and quartz is something called piezoelectric. That is a fancy way of saying that when you put quartz under pressure, it generates an electric charge. Now, if you have a chamber made of massive granite blocks and the entire weight of the pyramid is pushing down on them, you are looking at a giant power generator made of stone. Some researchers believe that the king's chamber was designed to vibrate at a very specific frequency. If you go inside that chamber today and you hum or sing at a low pitch, the whole room starts to resonate. It is like being inside the body of a giant guitar. The granite beams above the chamber are separated by spaces, almost like the teeth of a comb or the parts of a tuning fork. Why would they go through all the trouble of lifting these massive beams if it was just to hold up the ceiling? There are simpler ways to do that. But if you were building a machine designed to vibrate and create energy, this setup makes a lot of sense. Now, let's talk about the precision of these geometries, because this is where things get really wild. If you look at the joints between the granite blocks in the king's chamber, they are so tight that you cannot even fit a credit card or a thin piece of paper between them. They are cut with a level of accuracy that we usually only see in modern factories. But wait, it gets even better. Inside this chamber, there's a giant granite box that most people call a sarcophagus. But there are a few problems with that theory. First of all, the box is too big to fit through the narrow passages of the pyramid. That means it had to be placed there while the pyramid was still being built. It was literally built into the machine. Second, there was no lid ever found for it. And third, the box shows marks of a very advanced cutting technology. Sir Flinders Petrie, who was a famous archaeologist, studied this box over 100 years ago, and he was blown away. He noticed that the saw marks on the granite showed that the tool was cutting through the stone at a speed that was far beyond anything a hand saw could do. He calculated that the tool must have been under immense pressure, cutting through the granite as if it was softwood. It is like the ancient Egyptians were using high-speed drills and saws that we did not think existed back then. And it is not just a box. All around the Giza Plateau, researchers have found granite blocks with perfectly circular holes drilled into them. These are not just rough holes made by a hand tool. They have spiral grooves inside them that look like they were made by a modern machine drill. Some engineers have suggested that the only way to get those grooves is through ultrasonic drilling. Now, imagine a civilization using sound waves to drill through the hardest rock on the planet. Does that sound like a simple tomb to you? Not really. It looks like a high-tech workshop. And some of these granite blocks have depressions and carvings that look exactly like tracks for moving parts. Think about a modern engine where you have pistons moving back and forth in a cylinder. In the antechamber, just before you get to the king's chamber, there are these huge vertical grooves carved into the granite walls. Traditional history says these were part of a portcullis system to lower stones and block the entrance. But if you look at the design, they look much more like mechanical tracks for a sliding gear or a heavy piston. Everything in this complex seems to be pointing toward function rather than just fashion. Even the shape of the pyramid itself is a geometric masterpiece that hides a lot of secrets. Most people think the pyramid has 4 sides, but it actually has 8. There's a slight indentation on each side that you can only see from the air during the spring and autumn equinoxes when the sun hits it at just the right angle. This 8-sided geometry is a phenomenal feat of precision. It is like the pyramid was built as a giant mathematical constant in stone. It encodes a value of pi and the golden ratio in its dimensions. If you take the perimeter of the pyramid and divide it by twice its height, you get a number that is incredibly close to pi. Now, how did they know that? Most historians say the Greeks discovered pi thousands of years later. But it is right there in the geometry of the machine. It is as if the ancient builders were using the very laws of the universe to power their monument. The alignment of the structure is another piece of the puzzle. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of within 3/60ths of a degree. This is more accurate than the Meridian building at the Greenwich Observatory in London. To do that, you need a level of astronomical knowledge that is just mind-blowing. You would have to be tracking the stars for centuries to get that kind of precision. And when you combine that astronomy with the granite gears and the copper wiring, you start to see a picture of a machine that was designed to tap into the natural energy of the Earth and the stars. Some people think the pyramid was a giant wireless power plant that sent energy into the atmosphere. Others think it was a communication device or way to transform the human consciousness using sound and vibration. But whatever it was not just a pile of rocks. The granite was the heart of the system. It was a material that could handle the heat, the pressure, and the vibration of the machine. When you look at the unfinished obelisk in Aswan, you can see how they were cutting this granite. There are scoop marks in the stone that look like someone was using a giant ice cream scooper to pull out pieces of rock. This is granite we are talking about. You cannot scoop granite with a copper chisel. It would be like trying to cut a diamond with a butter knife. There had to be a different technology involved, something that changed the way the stone reacted to tools. Maybe it was heat or maybe it was sound, but the result was a level of geometric perfection that we are still trying to understand today. So, when you think about the machine beneath the pyramids, don't just think about the tunnels and the water. Think about the granite gears and the mathematical geometries that tied it all together. It was a complete system where every block and every angle served a purpose. The ancient Egyptians were working smarter, not harder, and they were using the natural properties of the earth to create something that has lasted for thousands of years. It is a powerful reminder that there is still so much we don't know about our own history. We are looking at the ruins of a technology that might have been even more integrated with nature than our own. And as we dig deeper into the granite and the geometry, we might just find that the machine is still waiting for us to figure out how to turn it back on. It is a mystery that is carved in stone, and every year we get a little bit closer to unlocking the code. The pyramids are not just monuments to the dead. They are monuments to the incredible potential of human engineering. They show us what happens when geometry and geology come together to create something that defies time itself. And we are just getting started with uncovering the secrets of the granite gears that kept this massive machine running in the ancient world. When we look at the Great Pyramid today, it feels like a finished masterpiece, a symbol of ancient perfection that has survived for thousands of years. But what if I told you that some researchers look at this massive pile of stone and see something completely different? Instead of a completed monument, they see an unfinished engine, a giant machine that was never quite turned on, or maybe it was turned on and then it broke. Think of it like a brand new luxury car sitting in a garage, but nobody ever put the spark plugs in or filled it up with gas. This theory is actually pretty wild when you start to look at the details. Most of the pyramids in Egypt have some kind of writing or decorations on the walls, especially the ones that came later, like those in the 5th and 6th dynasties. Those pyramids are covered in what we call the pyramid texts, which are basically directions for the pharaoh on how to get to the afterlife. But the Great Pyramid of Giza is totally different. There are no inscriptions, no paintings, and no hieroglyphs inside the main chambers at all. It is just bare polished stone. For a tomb that was supposed to be for a god king, this seems a little bit like they forgot to finish the decorations, right? But some people think this was intentional. If the pyramid was actually a machine designed to move energy or water, then adding carvings and paint would have been like putting stickers on the inside of a jet engine. It just does not make sense. This brings us back to the idea that the whole structure was built for a functional purpose rather than a symbolic one. In 2017, a project called Scan Pyramids used some really high-tech particles from outer space called muons to peek inside the Great Pyramid without ever touching a stone. And what they found was a huge surprise. They discovered a massive empty space right above the Grand Gallery, which they call the Big Void. It is about 100 feet long, and nobody knows what it is doing there. Is this just another empty room, or is it a missing part of the machinery? Some engineers believe this void could have held some kind of counterweight or a massive piece of equipment that was either removed or was never installed in the first place. Imagine if you were building a giant clock and you left out the main gear. The clock might look perfect from the outside, but it is never going to tell the time. This might be exactly what happened with the Great Pyramid. It is like the builders were in the middle of a massive engineering project, and then they just stopped. Let us talk about the materials again, because this is where the engine theory gets even more interesting. We know the pyramid is mostly made of limestone, which is a great insulator for electricity. But the inner chambers, like the one we call the King's Chamber, are made of red granite. Granite has a lot of quartz in it, and quartz is a very special mineral. When you squeeze quartz or put it under pressure, it creates a tiny bit of electricity. This is called the piezoelectric effect. Now imagine the weight of millions of tons of limestone pushing down on those granite chambers. That is a lot of pressure. If the ancient Egyptians knew about this, they could have been using the pyramid to generate some kind of resonance or vibration. Some experts have even noticed that the king's chamber is tuned to a very specific frequency. If you hum or chant inside it, the whole room seems to vibrate and carry the sound. It is like a giant acoustic guitar made of stone. But here's the thing: for a machine to work, all the parts had to be in place. And when we look at the very top of the Great Pyramid, something big is missing. Most people know that the pyramid does not have its top stone anymore. This is called the capstone or the pyramidon. Legend says it was made of solid gold, or at least covered in a thick layer of gold and silver. Gold is one of the best conductors of electricity in the world. If the pyramid was a power plant or a machine for harvesting energy from the atmosphere, the capstone would have been the most important part. It would have been the antenna that collected the energy and sent it down into the internal chambers. Without the capstone, the whole system is basically a giant ground wire. It is a circuit that cannot be closed. So what happened to it? Was it stolen by ancient looters who wanted the gold, or was it never actually put on top? If the builders realized that the engine was not working correctly, or if they ran out of resources, they might have just stopped. It is like building a massive skyscraper and then realizing you cannot afford the roof. You just leave it open to the sky. There's another clue that the pyramid might be an unfinished or broken engine, and it has to do with the shafts. Remember those narrow tunnels that lead out from the chambers? For a long time, people thought they were air shafts for the workers, or even pointed at specific stars for the soul of the pharaoh to fly out of. But when robots were sent up those shafts, they found something weird. The shafts in the queen's chamber do not actually go all the way to the outside. They are blocked by these small stone doors with copper handles. Now why would you put a door inside an air shaft? And why use copper? Copper is one of the best conductors for electricity. Some researchers think these were not doors at all, but electrical components like terminals or sensors. If the pyramid was supposed to be filled with water or some kind of chemical solution, those copper pins could have been part of a system to monitor the levels or the flow. But since the shafts are blocked and the copper handles look like they have been corroded, it looks like the system either failed or was never fully activated. It is like finding a house that is fully wired for electricity, but the wires do not lead to a power outlet. It is also possible that the engine did work for a little while, and then something went wrong. Inside the king's chamber, there are these massive cracks in the granite beams above the ceiling. These beams weigh up to 70 tons each, and they have been snapped like toothpicks. Most historians say this was caused by an earthquake, but others think it could have been an internal explosion or massive buildup of pressure that the machine could not handle. Imagine a steam engine getting too hot and blowing its lid. That could explain why the ancient Egyptians eventually walked away from the site and started building smaller, less complicated pyramids. They tried to build a giant high-tech machine, and it literally cracked under the pressure. This idea of the unfinished engine also explains why we find so many other strange structures around Egypt that look like they were abandoned mid-project. If you go to a place called Zawiat El Aryan, there's a massive pit that was supposed to be a pyramid, but only the foundations were ever built. The stones there are huge and perfectly polished, just like the ones in the Great Pyramid, but they are just sitting there in the sand. It looks like a construction site where the workers just dropped their tools and left for lunch and never came back. Maybe the ancient Egyptians were experimenting with a technology that they did not quite master. We think of them as these all-knowing masters of the universe, but maybe they were more like us. They were engineers who were trying to solve big problems like how to get clean water to their cities or how to create light and energy. They had a big idea and they spent decades building this massive machine, but in the end they could not make it work the way they wanted. There's also a theory that the environment changed, and that is what turned the engine off. We know that thousands of years ago the climate in Egypt was much wetter. The Nile River was closer to the pyramids, and there were lakes and streams all over the place. If the Great Pyramid was a hydraulic machine that needed a constant flow of water to function, then a long drought would have been a death sentence for the project. If the water dried up, the engine would have stopped. No more power, no more light, and no more reason to keep building. The Great Pyramid might be a reminder that even the most advanced civilizations can hit a wall. It is a giant stone computer with no software or massive rocket ship with no fuel. When we walk through those narrow tunnels today, we are not just walking through a tomb. We are walking through the guts of a machine that has been silent for 4,000 years. It is a ghost of a technology that we are only just beginning to understand. And speaking of understanding, the more we look at the layout of these structures, the more they look like something we would see on a modern blueprint. If you look at the pyramid complex from high above, some people say it looks exactly like a computer circuit board. You have the main processors, which are the pyramids, and then you have the pathways and the smaller buildings which act like resistors and capacitors. It is a crazy idea, right? But once you see the pattern, it is really hard to unsee it. We have to ask ourselves why they would go to all this trouble if it was not for something practical. Moving 2 million stones just to bury one person seems like a lot of work even for Pharaoh. But if those stones were part of a system that could change the lives of everyone in the country, then it makes much more sense why thousands of people would volunteer to help. They were not building a grave, they were building the future. They were trying to build a machine that could tap into the very power of the earth itself. But as we have seen with our own technology, things do not always go according to plan. Sometimes the engine stalls, and sometimes the power grid fails. The Great Pyramid stands there today as a giant question mark in the middle of the desert. It is a piece of hardware that is waiting for a technician who knows how to fix it. We are searching for the manual in the sand, and the more we dig, the more we realize that the ancient world was far more complex than we ever imagined. The secrets of this unfinished engine are still hidden deep within those granite walls. Every time we find a new void or new shaft, we are finding another piece of the puzzle. We are trying to figure out if this machine ever really breathed, or if it was always just a silent giant. And we are just starting to realize that the most important parts might be the ones we cannot see with our eyes. Now we have to look even deeper into the heart of the machine to see what else might be hiding in the dark. Because the story of the Great Pyramid is not just about what is on the surface, it is about the forces that were meant to flow through it. And that leads us to a whole new set of mysteries that are hidden in the very foundations of the Giza Plateau. One of these mysteries involved a giant subterranean chamber that was carved out of the solid bedrock long before the first stone of the pyramid was even laid. Some say this chamber was a fuel tank for the entire operation, and what scientists found down there recently is enough to make anyone rethink everything they know about ancient Egypt.